He called this snap election without informing his closest allies. His finance minister went on TV the other day and said the idea of calling the election was the fault of the president's clique of advisors, who he referred to as woodlice. Even President Macron's hand-picked prime minister, who is leading his party's parliamentary campaign, was not told about the decision to call the snap election. So it's very interesting that many of his ministers are now distancing themselves from the president, who is extremely unpopular in the country. They see him as an electoral liability.
Let's turn to the French election now, because the right-wing National Rally Party could be on the brink of power in France. They have a clear lead in the polls as voting begins today in the country's snap parliamentary elections. Let's speak to David Chazan, who is Times reporter in Paris. David, great to talk to you. Really interesting. Of course, we are the election station here, and we're covering all the elections that are happening over the course of 2024. But this one was not expected, and certainly a reaction, I think, just set the tone and the context for us, because it was really after the European elections delivered a bit of a shock.
Well, that's right. And President Macron decided to call this snap parliamentary election not a presidential election, only a parliamentary election, after his party was trounced by the hard-right National Rally, that's Marine Le Pen's party, in the European elections. And a lot of President Macron's closest allies and advisors are still appalled by this decision to call the election just weeks before the Paris Olympics begin, with very little time to campaign. President Macron's calculation appears to have been that his centrist bloc would face the hard-right National Rally, and he would be able to persuade voters that he's the only adult in the room, reconsider that decision to vote for what he sees as an extremist party in the European elections, and bring back a sense of normality. But what the polls are telling us is very, very different. It looks like the National Rally has actually widened its lead over Macron's party and its allies since the European elections. It's now, according to the opinion polls, getting about 36% of support among voters. And in second place, it's not Mr. Macron's bloc, but it's a hastily cobbled together alliance of leftist parties. They're on about 29%, with Macron's centrist bloc trailing on 20%. So this looks like it could be an extremely bad result for the president's centrist camp.
Just paint a picture for us of National Rally as a party, because we hear the phrase far right attributed to them. We hear that Marine Le Pen has worked to moderate them in some way. What sort of a grouping are they in terms of their beliefs?
Well, you're right. They were once seen as a beyond the pale, anti-Semitic, racist group. They were founded by Marine Le Pen's father, Jean-Marie Le Pen, and he is a Holocaust denier who has been convicted of hate speech and denying the Holocaust, which is an offence in France. And she's moved the party right back sort of into the middle ground. She's done everything she can to moderate its rhetoric, distance it from her father's anti-Semitic racist rhetoric. She's even had him expelled from the party over anti-Semitic comments. And she tried to make the party palatable to people who would never have considered voting for it when he was in charge. And she's rebranded it. She's even renamed it. It used to be called the National Front, and she's called it the National Rally. And she's picked up a lot of support among working class voters, people in rural communities and small towns who feel that the left wing have let them down in the past. They feel left behind. They see that there's prosperity in Paris and other big French cities, but they're left out. And she's put a 28-year-old, Jordan Bardella, that's her lieutenant. He's the man who would become prime minister if the National Rally wins these parliamentary elections. And he's been able to reach out to a lot of younger people. He's very social media savvy. He cultivates an unflappable image. His critics say that he's a bit short on content, but he is very good on style, very popular with female voters. He's handsome, charismatic, very charming. So she's tried to modernize the party and make it acceptable to people who would never have contemplated voting for it before. And she rejects that label of far right.
And just on the leftist bloc as well that you mentioned there, that's polling second, there are some concerns, not about the majority of those who are running in the leftist bloc, but some who have certainly put forward views that are anti-Semitic sometimes, that there are real concerns over that bloc as well, and what, in terms of it being sort of put together, who is actually a member of it. Just tell us about that a bit, David.
Well, it's a really uncomfortable alliance of people who you might describe as social democrats on the right wing of the French Socialist Party, the centre-left party, but it goes all the way to the far left France Unbowed party led by a former Trotskyist. So it encompasses a huge range of views and people who, frankly, have very little ideological common ground. And on the far left are people like the leader of France Unbowed, that's Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who has often been accused of expressing anti-Semitic views. He's very keen on supporting a Palestinian state. So one of in the manifesto is a promise to immediately recognize a Palestinian state. But it's interesting that this is a party that's promising big wage increases, big tax cuts, caps on energy prices. And so a fairly traditional tax and spend left-wing platform, but it's strikingly similar to the economic promises being made by the National Rally, which is also promising tax cuts, and it wants to encourage employers to increase wages by exempting wage increases from taxes. And both the right and the left want to repeal President Macron's unpopular pension reforms and lower the pension age, which he increased to 64, back to 62 in the case of the National Rally, or to 60 in the case of the Leftist Block.
Where does this leave President Macron? Because he'll still be in office, of course, but it must be very, very difficult for him politically if National Rally, for example, provides the prime minister, if there's some sort of huge change, really, in French national politics. It must, if this happens, as you think it will, and it looks as if the polls are putting us in that direction, that his authority will be diminished to a huge degree, and perhaps by his own hand, David?
Yeah, that's right. And I think, to describe the position this leaves him in a single word, it has to be isolated. He called this snap election without informing his closest allies. His finance minister went on TV the other day and said the idea of calling the election was the fault of the president's clique of advisors, who he referred to as woodlice. Even President Macron's hand-picked prime minister, who is leading his party's parliamentary campaign, was not told about the decision to call the snap election. So it's very interesting that many of his ministers are now distancing themselves from the president, who is extremely unpopular in the country. They see him as an electoral liability, and many of his own ministers also are now taking their distance from President Macron. So they believe that he's put his party and his own MPs in a terrible situation. He'll still keep his job after the parliamentary elections, but they probably, or many of them, may not keep theirs, and they are not happy.